For exactly 100 years, the colossal squid existed for science almost entirely as an absence, a creature defined by what was missing rather than what had actually been observed. Researchers knew it was real. They knew, roughly, how big it could grow. They knew it lived somewhere in the frigid waters of the Southern Ocean, and they knew, from remains recovered out of the stomachs of sperm whales and the beaks left behind in the guts of seabirds, that adult colossal squid could reach lengths approaching 7 meters and weights over 500 kilograms, making them the heaviest invertebrate known to exist on the planet, heavier even than the giant squid that had already achieved a kind of pop culture fame decades earlier. What nobody had, in a full century since the species was first formally identified and named in 1925, was a single confirmed image of a living colossal squid swimming through its own natural habitat. Every piece of physical evidence anyone had ever examined came from something already dead, dying, or partially digested. That changed on March 9th, 2025, in a stretch of remote, ice-cluttered ocean near the South Sandwich Islands in the South Atlantic, when a small remotely operated vehicle drifting through 600 meters of cold, dark water passed something almost invisible against the black backdrop of the deep sea, something with a body so transparent it looked to the researchers watching the live video feed less like an animal and more like a fragment of glass sculpture drifting slowly through open water. The vehicle responsible for the sighting was called Sebastian, a robotic submersible operated from the deck of the research vessel Falkor 2, which belongs to the Schmidt Ocean Institute, an organization founded specifically to support this kind of deep ocean exploration and to make its findings openly available to the broader scientific community and the public. On this particular expedition, part of a larger, multi-year initiative called the Ocean Census, an international collaboration formed specifically to accelerate the pace at which new marine species get discovered and formally documented, before environmental pressures on ocean ecosystems make that documentation considerably harder to complete. The team wasn't specifically hunting for a colossal squid, since nobody realistically plans an expedition around finding an animal that has never once been captured on camera in its own environment. They were conducting a broader survey of the deep waters around the South Sandwich Islands, a chain of remote, largely uninhabited volcanic islands sitting in one of the most isolated stretches of ocean on the planet, searching more generally for new and poorly understood marine life in a region that remains, even by the standards of deep-sea research, exceptionally undersurveyed. What makes the actual discovery even more striking is how it happened, because the identification wasn't made by a researcher staring intently at a live monitor aboard the ship. Schmidt Ocean Institute expeditions routinely stream their ROV footage live over the internet, a practice intended to make deep-sea exploration accessible to anyone curious enough to tune in, rather than restricting the experience to the handful of scientists physically present on the vessel. During this particular dive, it was a viewer watching the live stream from somewhere, outside the ship entirely, who first noticed the transparent, oddly shaped animal drifting past the camera and flagged it as a potential colossal squid, a moment that captures something genuinely remarkable about how modern deep-sea research increasingly operates, since a discovery that might once have depended entirely on the trained eye of an onboard specialist instead depended, at least in its earliest moment, on the attention of someone watching from a laptop or a phone screen thousands of kilometers away. Once the sighting had been flagged, the research team moved quickly to verify it properly, sending the recorded footage to independent squid experts, including Dr. Kat Bolstad of the Auckland University of Technology, a researcher who has spent much of her career specifically studying deep sea cephalopods and who was well positioned to examine the footage carefully enough to confirm or rule out the identification with real scientific confidence, rather than simply accepting an exciting guess at face value. The confirmation ultimately came down to a specific, distinctive anatomical detail: hooks. Colossal squid possess unique rotating hooks along portions of their arms and tentacles, a feature that distinguishes them from other, superficially similar deep-sea squid species, including a closely related animal called the glacial glass squid, which belongs to the same broader family, the Cranchidae, sometimes referred to informally as glass squids because of how transparent many species in this family remain, at least during their juvenile stages of life. Once Bolstad and the other consulted experts identified those characteristic hooks in the footage, the sighting moved from an exciting possibility into a confirmed scientific first, representing the first time in the 100-year history of colossal squid research that a living specimen had been directly observed and documented in its own natural habitat, rather than pulled up dead in a fishing net, discovered half-digested in a predator's stomach, or in one particularly famous earlier case from 2007, hauled up still alive but severely stressed after becoming entangled in a commercial fishing line targeting Antarctic toothfish near New Zealand's territorial waters, an incident that had, until this 2025 sighting, represented the closest thing science had to direct observation of a living colossal squid. despite the animal in that earlier case dying shortly after being brought aboard the fishing vessel. The animal captured on video in March 2025 was, in a sense, almost comically far removed from the popular image most people carry of a colossal squid as an enormous tentacled sea monster capable of doing battle with sperm whales in the crushing dark. It was a juvenile, measuring only about 30 centimeters in length, roughly the size of a standard school ruler, a fraction of the 7-meter length adults are estimated to reach at full maturity. Its body was almost completely transparent, allowing researchers watching the footage to see straight through portions of its mantle, a characteristic shared with other members of the glass squid family during their earlier life stages, and one that scientists believe likely serves as a form of camouflage in the dimly lit water, where these young squid apparently spend at least part of their early development, since a transparent body offers considerably better protection against visually hunting predators in low light conditions than a solid, opaque one would. Researchers studying the footage have noted that colossal squid are believed to gradually lose this transparent appearance as they mature, developing the deeper, more solid pigmentation associated with the handful of adult specimens recovered over the preceding century. Though the specific details of exactly how and when this transition occurs across the species' life cycle remain almost entirely unknown, since no juvenile colossal squid had ever previously been tracked or observed developing under any kind of direct, ongoing observation. This gap in basic life cycle knowledge highlights just how little concrete information researchers actually possessed about this species before the 2025 sighting, despite it being, by mass, the single largest invertebrate known to exist anywhere on the planet. Scientists had reasonably confident estimates for how large adult colossal squid could grow, based on measurements taken from recovered beaks and other hard body parts pulled from whale and seabird stomachs, since beak size correlates reasonably well with overall body size in cephalopods, and provides one of the few durable, measurable pieces of physical evidence that survives digestion intact. But almost everything else about the species, including basic questions like how quickly juveniles grow, what specific depths different life stages typically occupy, how the species hunts, how it reproduces, how long individual squid typically live, and how it behaves when not actively fleeing a predator or dying on the surface after becoming tangled in fishing gear, remained essentially unanswered, filled in only with educated inference drawn from research on other, somewhat better studied deep-sea cephalopod species. A century of scientific interest in an animal this large, this heavy, and this widely referenced in both academic literature and popular culture had produced remarkably little actual directly observed behavioral or ecological data, a genuinely unusual situation for a species of this size and profile, and one that speaks directly to just how difficult and expensive meaningful direct observation of deep sea life remains, even for an animal large enough that a fully grown adult would be difficult to miss if it happened to swim directly past a research vessel's cameras. What makes the March 2025 sighting even more remarkable is that it wasn't an isolated event during that particular research season. Roughly 6 weeks earlier, on January 25, 2025, a different Falkor 2 expedition working in waters near Antarctica had filmed the first confirmed footage of a related species, the glacial glass squid, Galateuthis glacialis, another elusive member of the same broader cranchide family that had similarly never before been captured on camera alive in its natural environment. Taken together, these two sightings, occurring within the same general research season and involving the same research vessel and ROV team, represent an almost unprecedented run of luck, or perhaps more accurately, an almost unprecedented demonstration of how much previously undocumented deep sea life becomes accessible once researchers combine the right technology with sustained, dedicated survey time in a genuinely underexplored region of ocean. Dr. Jyotika Virmani, the Schmidt Ocean Institute's executive director, described the back-to-back sightings of two different previously unfilmed squid species as a clear illustration of just how little humanity has actually observed of the animals. Living in the deep waters surrounding Antarctica and the broader Southern Ocean, a region that, despite its remoteness and hostility, apparently continues to host an entire population of large, visually striking, scientifically significant animals that have simply never crossed paths with a working camera until very recently. The broader expedition that produced the colossal squid footage wasn't limited to this single headline-grabbing discovery either, which helps illustrate just how much unexplored biological and geological material remains concentrated in this particular corner of the ocean. Over the course of a 35-day expedition to the South Sandwich Islands, the same research team also documented new hydrothermal vent systems, previously undescribed coral garden ecosystems, and what researchers strongly suspect includes multiple entirely new species that have not yet been fully identified, described, and formally added to the scientific record. a process that, unlike capturing a single dramatic piece of video footage, typically takes considerably longer to complete, often requiring physical specimen collection, detailed laboratory analysis, and peer-reviewed publication before a newly observed organism can be confidently confirmed and named as a genuinely new species rather than simply an unusual-looking individual belonging to an already known one. This pattern, where a single expedition to a genuinely remote and previously undersurveyed region produces not just one but many significant new findings, simultaneously tends to recur throughout deep sea exploration whenever research teams gain sustained access to a location that has historically received little to no direct scientific attention, reinforcing a broader point that keeps showing up across this entire field. The limiting factor holding back deep sea discovery has rarely been a shortage of things worth finding, and has almost always been a shortage of the ships, equipment, funding, and expedition time needed to actually go looking in the right places for long enough to find them. The technology that made this particular discovery possible deserves its own attention, because the ROV Sebastian represents a considerable advance over the kind of equipment that would have been available to researchers even a couple of decades earlier, when attempting a similar expedition to these same remote waters. Modern ROVs like Sebastian combine high-resolution video cameras, precise robotic manipulator arms capable of collecting physical samples without disturbing fragile deep-sea organisms too severely, and sophisticated lighting systems specifically engineered to illuminate the water column without startling or scattering. The very animals researchers are hoping to observe and document, since sudden, harsh, artificial light can cause many deep-sea species to flee immediately out of camera range before researchers ever get a clear, usable view of them. The vehicle operates tethered to the surface vessel via a cable that provides both power and a real-time data connection, allowing the crew on Falkor, too, to control Sebastian's movements with considerable precision while simultaneously streaming live footage back to the ship, and in this case, out to the wider public watching online. This live streaming capability, beyond simply making deep-sea exploration more publicly accessible and engaging, turned out to play a direct, functional role in the actual scientific discovery itself, since it was precisely this open, real-time broadcast that allowed an outside viewer to spot the colossal squid and flag it for the science team's attention, a genuinely unusual pathway for a major scientific discovery to take, blending professional expedition research with a kind of distributed, crowd-assisted observation more commonly associated with citizen science projects than with a formal, institutionally led deep-sea research expedition. Understanding why it took a full century to achieve this first confirmed sighting requires appreciating just how genuinely difficult colossal squid are to encounter under normal research conditions, even when researchers are specifically working in regions where the species is believed to live, the southern. Ocean surrounding Antarctica remains one of the most logistically challenging environments on the planet to conduct sustained research in, characterized by severe weather, persistent sea ice, extreme remoteness from any port capable of properly supporting a major research vessel, and correspondingly limited windows of time each year during which conditions are calm and accessible enough to support this kind of careful, patient underwater survey work. Layered on top of these already significant logistical challenges is the sheer size of the ocean volume involved and the apparent rarity, or at least the apparent difficulty, of directly observing colossal squid even within their known range, since the species appears to spend considerable time at depths and in locations that remain difficult to survey thoroughly, even with modern ROV technology, and since nothing about the species' behavior prior to this sighting was well enough understood to give researchers any particularly strong, evidence-based sense of exactly where or when a sighting might actually be most likely to occur. Finding a colossal squid, even a fully grown adult, in a body of water this vast, this cold, this dark, and this logistically difficult to access has always been closer to a matter of fortunate timing, layered on top of extensive, patient survey effort than a matter of researchers simply knowing exactly where to point a camera and waiting. The scientific value of this single piece of video footage extends considerably further than the simple fact of finally having visual confirmation that colossal squid exist and look roughly as researchers had expected them to look, based on prior physical specimens. Direct behavioral observation, even brief observation of a single juvenile individual, offers researchers genuinely new information that no amount of study focused on dead or dying specimens could ever have, provided researchers examining the footage have been able to study exactly how the juvenile colossal squid moves through the water column, how it holds its arms and tentacles in a relaxed, undisturbed state, rather than in whatever contorted position a specimen might end up in after being caught in fishing gear or pulled from a predator's stomach, and how its body responds to the presence of the ROV itself, information that, while limited to a single brief encounter, still, represents considerably more direct behavioral data than had existed for this species across the entire previous century of scientific study combined. Every additional sighting that hopefully follows this first one, whether of additional juveniles or, eventually, of adults observed alive and undisturbed in their natural deep water habitat, will add incrementally to a behavioral and ecological picture that researchers have essentially had to build from nothing, working previously only with anatomical measurements taken from recovered body parts and educated speculation drawn from research conducted on other, somewhat better studied cephalopod species that may or may not actually behave in ways closely comparable to how colossal squid themselves behave in their own specific deep-water environment. This discovery also fits into a broader, ongoing pattern that keeps recurring throughout modern deep-sea research, one where the actual pace of new discovery seems to be accelerating specifically because the underlying technology enabling that discovery, including ROV capability, underwater camera and lighting systems, live data transmission, and the broader institutional infrastructure supporting sustained, well-funded expedition work in genuinely remote ocean regions, has improved dramatically within just the past decade or two. The same basic combination of factors responsible for this colossal squid sighting, meaning capable modern ROV technology paired with sustained expedition, time in a genuinely undersurveyed region of ocean, has produced a steady stream of other significant deep-sea discoveries in recent years, including newly documented hydrothermal vent ecosystems, previously unknown coral garden habitats, and numerous species new to science identified during similar expeditions conducted by Schmidt Ocean Institute and comparable research organizations working in other remote ocean regions around the world. Taken individually, each of these discoveries might seem like an isolated, if exciting, scientific event. Taken together, they paint a considerably larger and more significant picture, one suggesting that the modern era of deep-sea exploration, enabled by genuinely capable modern robotic and imaging technology combined with dedicated, well-organized international research collaboration, may be producing new fundamental discoveries about ocean life at a pace unlike anything the field has previously experienced. A pace that shows little sign of slowing, given how much of the deep ocean remains, even now, essentially unsurveyed by any kind of detailed modern observation. Looking forward, the Schmidt Ocean Institute has indicated that Falkor, too, will not return specifically to Antarctic waters until 2028, with the vessel instead planning to spend the next several years conducting research expeditions in the South Atlantic Ocean off the coasts of Argentina and Uruguay. A decision reflecting the practical reality that any single research vessel, however capable, can only cover a limited amount of ocean territory each year, and that meaningful deep-sea research requires spreading available ship time across many different regions, rather than concentrating indefinitely on any single previously productive location. However, tempting that might be given the significance of what has already been found there. This planned shift doesn't mean researchers expect Southern Ocean exploration to simply pause for several years, since other research vessels operated by other institutions and international partners continue conducting their own expeditions in these waters, but it does mean that any additional colossal squid sightings occurring in the near term will most likely come from a different research team using different equipment, working under a different set of institutional priorities, illustrating how modern deep-sea discovery increasingly depends on this kind of distributed, collaborative effort spread across multiple institutions and countries, rather than on any single organization or vessel working in isolation. Placing the colossal squid discovery alongside the broader history of giant cephalopod research helps explain why this particular sighting generated as much scientific and public excitement as it did. The giant squid, a separate and somewhat smaller species than the colossal squid despite the two frequently being confused with one another in casual conversation, followed a strikingly similar path from folklore to confirmed science, treated for centuries as the stuff of sailors' tales and kraken legends before dead specimens. Washing ashore in the 19th century finally forced naturalists to accept the animal as real. Even after that acceptance, it took considerably longer, until 2004, for researchers to capture the first photograph of a live giant squid in its natural deep-sea habitat, and until 2012 for the first video footage of a live giant squid to be recorded. The colossal squid's own path to first confirmed footage followed a similar arc but stretched out even further, partly because the species lives in a considerably more remote and difficult to access region of ocean than the giant squid, which has been documented across a wider range of locations, including waters closer to more heavily researched coastlines. Comparing these two timelines highlights just how much basic biological confirmation about even the largest, most physically striking animals on the planet has depended on essentially a combination of luck, patience, and slowly improving technology, rather than on any kind of straightforward, predictable research timeline that scientists could have reliably projected in advance. Cephalopod researchers more broadly have long pointed to squid, and to deep-sea cephalopods in particular, as a category of animal disproportionately resistant to conventional research methods for reasons that go beyond simply living in a remote or difficult-to-access environment. Unlike many fish species, which can sometimes be captured alive and kept in aquarium settings for extended observation, most deep-sea squid species, including both giant and colossal squid, appear to be extremely poorly suited to survival in captivity, tending to suffer fatal injuries from even minor contact with tank walls or nets, given how physically delicate their bodies are compared to the pressure and support the surrounding deep water normally provides. This means that many other large, scientifically significant marine animals that researchers have been able to study for extended periods in controlled settings, gathering detailed behavioral and physiological data over months or years, nearly everything scientists know about how large deep-sea squid actually live and behave has had to come either from brief windows of direct observation in their natural habitat, of exactly the kind achieved during this 2025 expedition, or from analyzing physical remains after the animal has already died, a considerably more limited and indirect source of information that leaves enormous gaps in basic understanding of the animal's actual living behavior, hunting strategy, and day-to-day ecology. The specific research collaboration responsible for organizing this expedition also deserves some attention, since the Ocean Census Initiative that coordinated the broader survey effort represents a relatively new and increasingly influential model for how large-scale marine biodiversity research gets organized and funded. Rather than relying on a single research institution working independently, Ocean Census brings together multiple partner organizations, including the Nippon Foundation, the Nekton Foundation, Guiomar Helmholtz Center for Ocean Research in Germany, the University of Plymouth in the United Kingdom, and the British Antarctic Survey, alongside Schmidt Ocean Institute itself, pooling resources, expertise, and ship time across these various partners, specifically to accelerate the overall pace at which new marine species and previously undocumented ocean life get discovered, described, and added to the formal scientific record. This kind of pooled, multi-institutional collaborative model has become increasingly common in deep sea. Research generally, largely because the costs involved in operating a capable deep-sea research vessel and its associated ROV equipment for extended expedition periods, remain high enough that few individual institutions can realistically fund this kind of sustained research program entirely on their own, making international, multi-organization partnerships an increasingly necessary rather than merely convenient approach to conducting this kind of ambitious exploration work. The reaction from the broader scientific community following the announcement of the colossal squid footage also illustrates something worth noting about how modern deep sea discoveries get communicated and shared, compared to how similar findings might have been handled in earlier decades of ocean research. Rather than the footage remaining confined to specialist academic journals or conference presentations for months or years before reaching a wider audience, Schmidt Ocean Institute made both the video footage and accompanying photographs publicly available almost immediately following the confirmation process, distributing this material through its own website and media channels in a way specifically designed to reach general audiences quickly and directly, rather than filtering the discovery exclusively through traditional academic publication timelines. This approach reflects a broader shift within the deep sea research community toward treating public engagement and accessibility as a core part of the research mission itself, rather than as a secondary consideration handled only after the more formal scientific work has been completed. A shift that arguably contributed directly to how widely and quickly this particular discovery spread through mainstream news coverage, social media discussion, and general public awareness in a way that considerably less visually striking, though sometimes scientifically comparable, discoveries in other areas of marine biology often fail to achieve. Beyond the immediate excitement generated by the discovery itself, researchers studying colossal squid and related deep-sea cephalopods have pointed to several specific scientific questions. This kind of direct observation could eventually help answer questions that had previously been essentially unanswerable, given the complete absence of any living specimen ever observed under natural, undisturbed conditions. Understanding how juvenile colossal squid actually hunt, for instance, remains almost entirely theoretical, based mostly on inference from studying the digestive contents and physical characteristics of the relatively small number of specimens ever recovered, rather than on any direct behavioral observation of the animal actively pursuing or capturing prey. Similarly, basic questions about how colossal squid navigate the water column, whether juveniles and adults typically occupy meaningfully different depth ranges, how the species avoids or evades its own predators, which include sperm whales and various seabird species, known to prey on the squid based on stomach content analysis, and how individual squid interact with others of their own species, all remain open questions that future sightings, building on the foundation, established by this first confirmed encounter could eventually help address, provided researchers managed to secure the kind of sustained, repeated observational access to the species that has proven so difficult to achieve across the previous century of study. The unusual role that public live streaming played in this particular discovery has also prompted some reflection within the deep sea research community about how future expeditions might deliberately build on this same approach, rather than treating the outside viewer's identification as simply a fortunate, unplanned coincidence. Schmidt Ocean Institute has continued expanding its practice of live streaming ROV dives publicly, partly because doing so has demonstrably proven capable of contributing directly to the research process itself, as this colossal squid sighting illustrates, and partly because it serves the Institute's broader mission of making deep sea exploration and discovery more accessible and engaging to people who will never have the opportunity to join an expedition in person. Some researchers have suggested that this kind of distributed, publicly accessible observation model, effectively recruiting an enormous and highly attentive volunteer audience, watching footage in real time from locations scattered around the world, could become an increasingly valuable and formally recognized component of future deep sea research methodology, rather than remaining simply a pleasant side benefit of institutional transparency, particularly given how much unexplored ocean remains and how comparatively limited the number of trained specialists available to watch every minute of footage from every expedition in real time actually is, compared to the potentially much larger pool of engaged, attentive members of the public who might reasonably be expected to notice something unusual during a live broadcast, exactly as happened during this particular dive. There's a genuinely useful broader lesson embedded in this story about a 100-year-old scientific mystery finally being resolved by little more than a routinely streamed ROV dive and an attentive viewer watching from itself. It illustrates, in about as direct and visually compelling a way as deep sea science ever manages to produce, just how much of what remains unknown about ocean life isn't necessarily hidden, because it's inherently unobservable or permanently beyond human reach, but simply because sustained, well-equipped, properly funded observation hasn't yet been pointed at the right patch of ocean for long enough to catch it. The colossal squid wasn't hiding from science in any meaningful sense for the past 100 years. It was simply living its normal life, in its normal deep water habitat, in a genuinely remote corner of one of the coldest, most logistically difficult oceans on the planet, waiting for exactly the right combination of capable technology, dedicated expedition time, and, in this particular case, a bit of good fortune and an attentive online viewer to finally cross paths with a working camera. Given how much of the deep ocean remains in a broadly similar state of unobserved obscurity, and given how quickly modern exploration technology continues to improve, researchers in this field increasingly expect that stories like this one, a century-old mystery finally resolved by a single, unplanned, almost accidental encounter, will likely keep recurring, each one chipping away a little further at exactly how much of the ocean's largest, strangest, and most scientifically significant inhabitants still remain for now entirely unseen. The colossal squid spent 100 years as a creature known only through its absence, understood almost entirely through the evidence left behind by its own death. What the March 2025 footage finally offered, for the briefest of moments, and through the transparent, glass-like body of a single 30-centimeter juvenile drifting quietly through 600 meters of cold South Atlantic water, was something considerably rarer than another dead specimen or another fragment of anatomical data. It was simply the animal itself, alive, undisturbed, and entirely unaware that, after an entire century of being studied only in death, it had just become the first of its kind that science had ever actually seen.